Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Especially thank you for being here for the kickoff of the NOAA Research OAR, the Oceanic and Atmospheric Research arm of NOAA's 2025 Outstanding Scientific Paper Seminar Series. My name is Katie Poser. I'm the Outreach Librarian for the NOAA Library, and I'm truly delighted to introduce the authors of this year's NOAA papers. The Outstanding Scientific Paper Award is a program established by OAR to celebrate the incredible science that OAR employees and affiliates are producing. After all, the heart of any great research organization is the quality of its publications. This award is our way of celebrating authors who do just that. They produce brilliant work that advances OAR and NOAA's mission, stands up to the rigorous, independent scrutiny of peer review. While these authors received formal recognition this summer, we wanted to create a more informal space for them to share their work in more detail. Today's seminar is a fantastic opportunity to hear directly from our authors and to dive into their research together as we see firsthand the significant impact their papers have had on OAR and on NOAA as a whole. So today's first seminar is entitled Midlatitude Ozone Depletion and Air Quality Impacts from Industrial Halogen Emissions in the Great Salt Lake Basin. So again, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to our presenter today, Carolyn Womack, who is a research scientist at NOAA's Chemical Sciences Laboratory. And I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn to get started.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
You can.
Okay, I'm going to turn off my video so that you can see my full screen. And yeah, I'm going to get started talking about this project that started in 2017. So it's been almost 8 years since the beginning of this project. So I wanted to start off by just giving a little bit of acknowledging the many people who worked on this. This was a big project that had a lot of contributors, and nothing would have been possible without them. So these are just a few of the names, although there's many more people who work behind the scenes on these kinds of projects. And I'd particularly like to thank the other people at NOAA's Chemical Sciences Lab and Series, as well as all of these other collaborators and the Utah Department of Air Quality, who did a lot of the facilitating of the logistics of this campaign. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of background, just because trying to explain this halogen emissions finding that we found requires us to talk a little bit about what was going on, why we wound up where we wound up, and why we think that this result means something. So I'll start off just talking about air quality in northern Utah. I'm not from the West, I'm from New England, and so it was a surprise to me to learn that Utah has pretty poor air quality in the winter. I thought of it as a pretty pristine place, but in fact, it's one of the major areas that at one point was one of the two major areas of the US that was in serious non-attainment for PM 2.5. That's particles of diameter less than 2.5 microns. And furthermore, the trend is really a seasonal one. So this plot down here shows the day of year, and then each gray line shows the daily average for PM 2.5 for each of the last 20 years. And what you can see is that with a few exceptions in the summer, most of the high PM 2.5 concentrations happen in the winter. And that's true in both the Salt Lake Valley and its surrounding valleys, as well as the San Joaquin Valley, the Central Valley of California. So in Salt Lake City, tends to, like these other areas, the pollution tends to be episodic rather than constant. So what happens is that Salt Lake is located here near the Great Salt Lake, but in a very mountainous terrain. So it acts sort of like a bowl, trapping pollutants close to the surface during these meteorological events called persistent cold air pools, which is when a high pressure system moves in over a mountain basin and it creates a temperature inversion. So there's warmer air aloft, cooler air below, and so it's like a lid on a pot. And for days to even more than a week. There can be really stagnant air in these mountainous areas. And the emissions from the surface just continue to build up because they have nowhere to go. So it's been well established that the poor air quality in Salt Lake City tends to happen during these PCAPs, or persistent cool air pools. And furthermore, it's already well understood that the dominant pollutant here is a type of PM2.5 called ammonium nitrate, which is NH4NO3, which is formed, it's not emitted directly, it's formed from the emissions of gas phase ammonia, which tends to come from livestock and agriculture, and nitric acid. Let's see if I can switch over to a laser pointer. Okay, so and it has been found in the past that it typically is true that there's more ammonia than nitric acid around. So what's really controlling the formation of the ammonium nitrate aerosol is the formation of nitric acid, which in itself comes from gas phase reactions in the atmosphere from emissions. So to simplify this a little bit, when we're talking about particulate matter pollution, we are talking about wintertime particulate matter, which is essentially all ammonium nitrate aerosol, which is in many cases what we're going to be focusing on is the formation of nitric acid. So we started this project in 2017. This was a collaboration between NOAA Chemical Sciences Lab and the Utah Division of Air Quality, or UDAC. We worked on this project together because they were interested in trying to understand the causes for this pollution. And specifically, more than what they already knew, what are the chemical mechanisms that lead to nitric acid, and what would their control strategies be? So this is, that was the reason that we arrived in the winter of 2017. We had 3 different ground sites that are shown here in these triangles, 2 in the Salt Lake Valley, 1 in the Cache Valley. And we also had an instrumented aircraft. This is the NOAA Twin Otter aircraft, which we filled with scientific instrumentation and then did repeated flights throughout the area. So this trace shows one example flight, and in this case, it's colored by particulate nitrate, or the ammonium nitrate aerosol. So you can see that it is lower in more and less populated areas, but in these city areas in Salt Lake, Provo, and the Cache Valley, it can get quite high. So I'm not going to talk too much more about the details of this campaign. There's a number of really good papers that are out there that go into some of the details. So you can feel free to check any of those out. Just to say that we got lucky and we did see 2 of these pollution events during the 5 weeks that we were there. And it was true that ammonium nitrate was the dominant particulate matter, and ammonia was in excess. So this was the typical kinds of conditions that we wanted to study. We were there for 5 weeks. We collected a lot of really great data. And so what I want to talk about next is actually a paper that we wrote before we wrote the paper that I'm about to talk about, because that really set the stage for how we understood why these halogens made a difference. So this is just a single slide just to explain that our current understanding of the formation of particulate nitrate is shown here. And if you're not a chemist, this can look a little bit overwhelming, but the point is that the emissions that come from anthropogenic emissions are VOCs and NOx, which is normally in the form of nitrogen oxide. And they enter into this gas phase complicated chemistry where there's a lot of reactions going on, but one of the outputs is nitric acid, which is shown in red. And there's both a daytime and a nighttime chemistry. And the point of this is that it is quite complicated. It's not just as simple as saying we as state regulators are going to regulate the emissions of one of these things, and therefore the pollution will go down. It's more complicated than that. And in fact, the result of this first paper was showing that the Salt Lake Valley is most sensitive to reductions in these volatile organic compounds because of their role in propagating this cyclical formation of a nitric acid. NOx is a more complicated story because, as you can see, it can both accelerate this process, but it also provides a method for exiting this process. So this is well known in our understanding of ozone chemistry, but it wasn't really quite well known for nitrate aerosol. But the results of this first paper were that Salt Lake City is sitting in this interesting position where the particulate matter is actually very sensitive to these the oxidation of NOx from VOCs, whereas it is actually reversely sensitive to NO, meaning that reductions in NOx emissions would actually make the pollution a little bit worse at first before coming down. So I'm going to set this aside and we'll come back to this because this is the framework through which we understand why these halogens matter. So on to the real main part of this story was the halogen emissions that were detected from an industrial source in the Salt Lake Valley during this campaign and why they matter. So on the very first day of the campaign, which was January 16th, 2017, we did our first flight, taking off from Salt Lake International Airport, which is over here, doing a loop around, and then we came around because we were aware that there was some industrial activity going over on the west side of the Great Salt Lake, which is shown here. And as you can see by this colored flight track where ozone is red in most of the area, but then it dives down to basically be basically zero near this industrial plant. That's a really interesting and unusual thing to observe, and I'll explain why. So this is a time trace going from about here around this and then over here. So you can see that as we were coming along towards that industrial area, our ozone was at about 50 ppb, which is pretty normal. And then all of a sudden it dipped down to basically zero. And then the plane went up a little bit and it recovered, and then went back down and it went back down. And then as we flew away from that area, it recovered. So it's not entirely unheard of to have ozone titration, but almost always it comes from the reactions with NO as part of NOx emissions. And so that would be the most obvious explanation. However, in this case, I've also plotted the NOx concentrations on in blue, and you can see that there really is not anything there. Whereas further downwind, you do see a little bit, and there's a little bit of dip here. So those are sort of inversely correlated with each other, which makes sense. But here, something else is happening. And the evidence for this was that we also had an instrument that was measuring halogens. So this is chlorine, bromine, and BrCl. So these are all dihalogen species. And this time trace shows the concentrations of those species as we flew around this area. And if you know, if you have any familiarity with these species, you might look at this and say, that's a typo, that should be parts per trillion. But no, it was parts per billion. It was shockingly large amounts of these halogens, more so than we tend to see ever. And so this was indicating that there might be some correlation between these two things. But the real, the factor that really made us feel that this was really what was happening was that we kept going back, we kept seeing the same things. But when we flew there at night, because we were flying at all times of day, this is an example trace of what happens when we flew around that industrial area at night. So again, the red is showing the ozone. Now, this is a pretty typical behavior that you would see where the ozone goes down, but that's because the NOx has gone up. So these are just reacting with each other. This is typical urban industrial types of behavior. And you see it again here and here as we went around the plant a few times. And what was also interesting was that at that same time, these halogen peaks were still there, but they were 10 times higher. And so all of this strongly points to a phenomenon called halogen-induced ozone depletions, meaning these dihalogens only react during the day because the sunlight breaks them apart, and then they react with the ozone. So this is, these initial observations were pointing to that. And so I want to take a minute to just talk a little bit about this phenomenon, because this didn't come out of nowhere. Halogen-induced ozone depletions actually have a long history in atmospheric chemistry. What many people are more familiar with is the concept of the ozone depletion in the ozone layer. So I'm gonna plot out some chemistry from these different scenarios. So up in this top left-hand corner, we have an example of what's going on in the stratosphere. So in this case, chlorine radicals are brought up to the stratosphere by long-lived CFCs or other related compounds. They then react with ozone, thus depleting the ozone layer to form ClO, which then self-reacts to make Cl2, which then gets reacted back to chlorine, and this becomes like a catalytic process. So even a very small amount of chlorine can cause long depletions in the ozone, because the number of times that this goes around this circle, which is also called the chain length, can be on the orders of tens of thousands. So that's probably the context for which halogen-induced ozone depletions are most familiar. But this also happens in the tropospheric Arctic regions. So there's a phenomenon called the bromine explosion, which happens in springtime, where halogens in the aqueous phase are released from salt water in very small amounts, mostly in the form of bromine, which is another halogen. But then they enter into the same cycle where there's depletion and then reformation, and then it goes around into this circle. And so this is a well-known phenomenon, but it's in the Arctic. There is even some evidence for halogen chemistry being relevant in the troposphere, in mid-latitudes near coasts, where chlorine-containing aerosols will evaporate, form ClNO2 in the gas phase, which then can be photolyzed to form the Cl radicals. And then the chemistry is a little bit different just because it now has other things to react with in a polluted urban environment. But all of these numbers are still quite low. And so what poses a sort of very different type of chemistry is that we don't know of another area where there is such a dramatically high amount of direct emissions of the dihalogens. We are talking about concentrations that are 1,000 to 10,000 times higher than anything seen in the tropospheric coastal mid-latitude regions. And this is also happening directly upwind of a major city, Salt Lake City. So the question then is, how does this chemistry that we understand pretty well, this triangle shows up in all of these scenarios, so we understand the basics of this triangle, but what happens when you inject this into a polluted urban area? What happens next after these things form? Can they react with other things? Can this react with VOCs to sort of perturb that cycle for forming a particulate nitrate that I was showing before? So that's the context for why halogen chemistry can be an important player in this pollution story. So the question that I think would be the natural next thing to ask is, are you sure that this is right? Because these are extremely high concentrations. Is there a problem with the instrument? Well, I would say, one, no. We measured this many, many times over half the flights. Well, anytime we went in that area, we saw some evidence of these emissions. The instrument is called the chemical ionization mass spectrometer. It's a very well-known and well-characterized instrument for measuring all number of halogen species. Yes, there are some instrument interferences, but it was, we feel pretty confident that these are very high levels of these halogen compounds. And then the next question is, well, are you sure that this industrial area is the source? This is a particular plant on the west side of the Great Salt Lake. And so let me switch back to that off. So this is a video taken by one of the scientists on board. It was a nighttime flight, so you can actually kind of see the plume. And so just play it. It's kind of going in slow motion. There's the plant, there's the plume, and right as we transmitted through it, that was where we saw the peak. So we were able to visually confirm that the industrial source was exactly where these halogens were coming from. Okay, so the first thing that we wanted to do was try and understand how much, because it seemed like these concentrations were high, but we were also very close to the plant. So this was undertaken by a graduate student in our lab named Wyndham Chase. She undertook these series of experiments where she looked through all of the nighttime flights. So this is removing any photochemistry from the equation, just saying these are just pure emissions. There's no downwind chemistry happening. Just let's figure out exactly how much of each of these species is being emitted by this plant, which you can kind of see here. And so she used this method where she took all of the perpendicular transects where we went straight through the plume, and taking the width of the plume, assuming a cylindrical plume, and accounting for the wind speed, she was able to derive a emission flux, meaning a mass of chemical species per unit time, based on these assumptions. Now, of course, it's probably not true that these plumes are perfectly cylindrical, and it's hard to get it to be exactly perpendicular. So that's where there's kind of a wide range. But if you look at the average values that she derived for the grams per second of each of these species, so Cl2, HCl, which is another chlorine derivative, bromine, and BrCl, as well as NOx, which is a standard emission from these sorts of industrial power plants, these numbers line up pretty well with what the plant itself reported. So two things to mention here. One is that when you look at this in terms of grams per second, it maybe doesn't seem like that much, but if you scale that up to their yearly output, they were reporting in 2017, which granted was a high year, they were reporting nearly 8 million pounds of chlorine emitted, which is not only higher than any other facility in the US, it's higher than the rest of the facilities in the US combined. So more than 50% of the Cl2 emitted in this country comes from this one facility. And the other thing to note is that the bromine species are not reported because they're not required to be, because they are not on the list of the things that the EPA asks for. So they didn't report it. We don't have any information about what they think their emission flux is. But if we were to take these values and scale them to what the known chlorine emissions are, this would be on the order of 2.5 million pounds of these bromine species, which we think is significant. So that's the emissions side. And then the next question is, well, what's the effect on the surrounding air? We know that there's this depletion of ozone right in the vicinity. That's not necessarily an issue because, as we know, ozone is a pollutant. But the question is what happens after that as the air keeps moving towards these populated areas. So in these two plots, I've shown every single time we found a plume that we felt that based on the concentrations of the halogens and the depletion of the ozone and the direction of the wind, we felt confident could be traced back to this magnesium facility. And so it was 67 different plumes. As you can see, the highest concentrations of the halogens are concentrated right very close to the plant. However, there is evidence of some ozone depletion that can't be attributed to the normal NOx titration in many different places throughout the populated areas of Salt Lake City. This is the Salt Lake Valley down here, Provo is down here, and again, this is the Cache Valley. So all of this area is populated. So what we wanted to do was to put this into a chemical model. To do that, we need to know how old these plumes are, because what we're looking at is what is the chemistry that has occurred in the plume as it transported from the source to where the transect is, and furthermore, what will happen as it continues to move downwind. This was probably the trickiest part of the model because the whole point of these pollution episodes is that the air is very stagnant. There's not a lot of wind, and whatever wind that we have, it's pretty light and variable. So we worked with our collaborators at the University of Utah. So this is Professor John Lynn's work. He runs the stochastic time-inverted Lagrangian transport model, which is basically a model for determining where an air parcel may have come from. So he ran this along the aircraft trajectory every 1 or 2 minutes. So for example, this is from one of the flight days. The plane was coming in around here, and every 1 to 2 minutes along this flight path, he ran this model to see where do we think that air came from. And because this is a probabilistic model, he had to do it 200 times for every step, and there's going to be some natural uncertainty in there. But you can see that for example, this is a period where we saw a big spike in BR2. There's a reasonable assumption that air came from this industrial facility. And based on these trajectories, we can tell exactly how old that plume is. Likewise, this one is pretty obvious that the wind was coming from this direction. So of course we saw evidence of the emission plume right here. Further downwind, this might be an hour or two downwind, there were definitely some increases in bromine, and it may not otherwise have been immediately obvious that this was coming from air that was influenced from this side of the lake, but the Stilt model pretty much confirms this. So now I'm showing each one of these plumes that we measured. Now it's colored by plume age. So the plumes that we intercepted closer to the plant are obviously less than an hour old. The ones that were intercepted further downwind in the populated areas might be 8 to 12 to older hours. I'm going to show one particular set of plume transects in particular. This was January 18th, where we did this path with the plane and found a couple of different transects, and they're colored here by plume age. So that allows us to start putting in what we know about the chemical reactivity of all of these species into a model and say, based on that, can we reproduce what we saw on all of these transects? So we used a 1D chemical box model called FOAM, which was developed by Glenn Wolfe at NASA Goddard. I can answer more questions about the details of this model if necessary, but just suffice to say that it uses a very detailed, explicit chemical mechanism called the MCM, which has something like 15,000 reactions in it. And we tied our observations to our initial observations at the point nearest to the plant. And then, there's a number of different things that we chose to do with the model, and I can answer anybody who has any questions about that. So here's the output of that one example day that I was showing. This is January 18th. The red shows the observations that we saw, and then the black is the results of the model. And as you can see, there is quite a bit of variability in these red dots, but we think that the black model is reproducing that pretty well. So it's starting with high concentrations of these 3 halogens, which then decay to close to zero due to dilution. And then over here, we have ozone, and the model is able to successfully reproduce the immediate drop in ozone, which is so fast that's kind of hard to see on this plot, followed by a slow recovery as the plume moves across the Great Salt Lake towards the populated areas. So we were happy with this model run. And then the question for us then becomes, well, what does this actually mean? Because, like I said before, a depletion in ozone isn't necessarily a problem. But the thing about that is, if you go back to the chemistry, these halogens don't disappear. They're just reacting to form other halogenated species. And so natural question is, what happens as this air continues to move downwind across the lake where nobody is breathing the air towards the city where a lot of people are breathing the air? And a city introduces a whole other range of chemical pollutants such as NOx and VOCs. So how does this chemistry play into what our understanding was of the buildup of these particulate nitrate episodes? And so the short answer is that using our chemical model, we were able to turn things on and off, experiment with how things change as you adjust the inputs of the models. And we're able to demonstrate that what's happening here is that the chlorine and the bromine radicals during the day, when they're photolytically produced, are accelerating this process, meaning they're providing another way for VOCs to get oxidized to these short-lived radical species, which then oxidize the NOx chemistry into nitric acid, which then becomes particulate nitrate. So this brings together our two papers and really helps us understand that because our first paper showed that the whole system was very sensitive to the amount of VOCs, it makes a lot of sense that the inclusion of these very reactive species to accelerate the chemical processing of the VOCs would play a significant role in the growth of particulate nitrate. Then, of course, the question is how much? So we ran two side-by-side models that were exactly the same, the only difference being that we ran one model with those halogen species that we think are what was really happening, and one where we removed it, and looked at the change in the output of these key chemical species. So HO2, RO2 are these two species down here. They're key intermediates in this whole formation process. And we also looked just at the formation of particulate nitrate. And so what we can see is that within the plume, there was a very big change between when the model had halogens in it and when it didn't. And so that's meaningful in some way because this is a very chemically detailed box model, but it would also be fair to say that most people are not living inside that plume. And so a zero-dimensional box model is a pretty simplified one. So we turned then to our colleague, Siwan Wang, who is an expert modeler. And so he ran a much more detailed chemical model called ChemChem, which is a regional chemical transport model that takes a much more detailed look at the topography of the area, accounts for the effect of the Great Salt Lake, has a little bit more simplified chemistry, but based on what we had learned, we figured out how to use the chemistry that was going to most accurately tell us something about the halogens. And so these are the results of his modeling work down here, where likewise we saw a much higher amount of these HO2 short-lived radicals, a depletion of ozone right near the area, and this is the sort of key result of this paper is that in between the output of these halogen emissions and when it gets to the urban areas, there, according to this model, could be anywhere from about 10 to 25% change in PM 2.5 due to the inclusion of halogens. So what this is saying is that due to one source, we think that a side-by-side model where one has halogens and one doesn't, the one with halogens will have up to 25% higher PM 2.5. And in a region that is plagued by high PM 2.5, this is pretty significant. So we published this paper in January 2023. And what happened next was surprising even to us. It was sort of immediately picked up by the local news. Obviously, the media in Salt Lake has a great interest in causes of air pollution, and this is sort of an unusual result because you don't usually tie pollution to one single facility. There was an existing state legislature bill that was making its way through the legislature, but they rewrote it at the last minute to mention that the state should come up with a bromine inventory. I got a little bit involved with testifying in front of the subcommittee, but very quickly that bill passed. And the bill mandates that the state create a bromine inventory. And the question, is that, we had focused on this one facility, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other facilities in Utah or in the US that could potentially be producing bromine that we don't know about because, again, it's not currently being regulated. And so that was 2 years ago. And actually, it's been fairly quiet since then for other reasons that were not related to us. The plant refocused their activities on, they transitioned into lithium production and are now they're down for maintenance and for some other reasons. And so actually there has not been another opportunity to measure the pollution or the halogen emissions coming from that facility. So at the moment, this is kind of where we leave this story. I think that we don't know exactly what the future of that facility will be, but we learned a lot about halogens and how they affect air quality. And I think that there's probably, this is the only magnesium facility in the US, but there are others in other countries. And so I think we learned a lot about what kinds of unexpected emissions there might be from those types of facilities. So I'll just wrap up here with a quick summary. So just to summarize what we did, we went to the Great Salt Lake trying to understand PM 2.5 formation during wintertime pollution episodes. We sort of stumbled upon an interesting result where we found these high concentrations of halogen species. We were able to quantify them using a transect method, found good agreement within for the chlorine species between what we found and what the plant itself reports, but there's nothing to compare to against bromine. However, it does seem as though those emissions were pretty significant. And then modeling implied that the presence of halogen species increases PM 2.5 because it amplifies this VOC oxidation process to form particulate nitrate. So I'd just like to end by thanking OAR for this award. It's really a great honor. And of course, this was a huge team effort. And I'd like to thank the entire UWFPS team for their tireless work, including Siwon Wong for the modeling and Wyndham Chase for the emissions work. And with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. This was excellent. So I'm gonna stop your screen share and move you over to slides. Make sure you get and see if anyone has any questions. We did have one come in a few minutes ago, and that is what altitude did the Twin Otter fly while collecting data?
So we flew between as high as 12 or 13,000 feet, which is the maximum altitude of the Twin Otter. But at our lowest point, we were about 500 feet above the water. So a wide range.
Yeah, very wide range. And I did see that the OAR had done a story on this on their webpage, but there was a question, how did you know you were in the plume? And you said you could smell it?
Yes. Yep, that was another factor. It smelled like bleach, or that's what it smelled like to us. Bleach has chlorine in it, so I suppose that's why that's what it smelled like to us.
Very, very cool. Well, I have in the chat, I just call people's attention to the chat in case you had that closed. I put in the paper links and also the link to the 2019 paper as well that informed this most current one. And then also reiterated that Carolyn's email is in here as well if you have questions and want to reach out separately. And our next question has showed up. So are there any natural halogen sources from the Great Salt Lake?
Yes. So the Great Salt Lake is very salty, and salt is, contains chlorine and also contains bromine as a minor component of that. And so it's a natural question, like, of course, why couldn't this be from the lake? Well, there's a couple answers to that. One is that because of the altitude of the flight, we actually flew up and down and got below the plume and went back up and went through it and back down below it and went up above it. So these extremely high values are just there, if that was really coming from the lake, there would be a gradient with the highest values closest to the surface of the lake, and that's just not what we saw. And then secondly, there is, uh, emissions from the Salt Lake has been something that has been studied. It's a little bit different because the natural form of halogens from salt are not usually the dihalogens that we were observing. So that was another key piece of evidence. But really, it was just the quantity and the fact that it was reproducible as we flew visually into the plume.
Thank you. About our next question. The model showed greatest PM2.5 enhancement near the plant. What is the fate of that matter? Dilution, chemical destruction, or something else?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There's in these, so I should say that this is a percentage. And so this is a percentage increase over what would be there without the halogens. And so it looks as though the highest percentage change is closest to the facility, but that doesn't mean that the highest concentration is closest to the facility. So I guess that graphic maybe can be a little bit misleading. I would say that the general fate of PM 2.5 in that area is eventually it will get rained out or transported as the inversion breaks up and the winds pick up and it's able to dilute that pollution out of the valley. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm picturing from your first initial slides the fact that Salt Lake City is in this, in the mountain range there, and kind of, gets all of that stuff gets trapped in there.
Yes, right. But it doesn't stay forever. It does eventually. The winds pick up, the high pressure system moves out, and so you're able to get this dilution, this natural like surface to free troposphere dilution, and it all eventually moves out, or it snows and then it rains out.
We did have a question. It ended up in the chat, so I can't show it on the screen. But if everyone looks in the chat, you can see this question yourself. How large were U.S. magnesium emissions compared to natural evaporation from Salt Lake?
The short answer is much larger. But it's a little hard to put an exact number on it for a couple of reasons. One is, again, we're talking about different emissions. So the emissions from the facility were dihalogens as opposed to the natural evaporation from the Salt Lake, which it tends to be can be in halogenated aerosols as well as some other gas phase compounds. So it's a little hard to make that comparison. And also, the natural evaporation rate from the Salt Lake can vary a lot depending on the time of year or year to year, because the salinity of the Salt Lake is always changing. So that will affect the absolute evaporation. And then also the surface area is changing as the lake level rises and falls. So there's a lot that goes into how much is actually naturally evaporating. So it's a little hard to put a number on it, but suffice it to say, the concentrations that we were seeing were much, much higher than anything you would expect to see from the natural evaporation.
So much for answering all these questions. I'm not seeing new ones pop up, so we might be reaching the end of our presentation here. But I'll leave the questions open for now, and I'm gonna really quickly segue and say that this is just the first in a series. So the next one in the 2025 OAR Outstanding Scientific Paper summer series is the Seasonal Overturn and Stratification Changes Drive Deep Water Warming in One of the Earth's Largest Lakes, which will be held on Tuesday next week around noon East Coast time. So just wanted to remind people of the next one coming up. Thank you so much for letting me pop over to that. And then I'm going to come back to Carolyn here. And I want to thank you so much for giving this presentation. And oh Lord, we got one last question. Are you up for it?
Sure.
Okay. Rounding us out here. Last question. Do you expect to do additional flights while the plant is not polluting?
That's a great question. We actually have already. This past summer, we did another campaign that was in the summer. So it was looking at summertime ozone rather than wintertime particulate nitrate, which is a little bit different. But we did fly with an instrument that was looking downwards and should be able to detect bromine oxide, which is one of the things that we would expect to see. And I don't want to speak up and say definitively, but we did not see any evidence of the same kind of output, which is expected because they are currently not operating. I think a very interesting question for us and for everyone is, can we do this sort of analysis again and see what we think the effect is with the absence of halogens? And that's something that we're working on, but I don't quite have an answer yet.
That's a very good question. So now I think we can say that we've reached the end of our presentation. Thank everyone for joining. Oh, and someone has commented, don't forget about the 2023 Aero MMA flights. Oh, this must be...
Oh, aroma flights.
Aroma.
Yes, sorry.
Brilliant.
I forgot about that. Thanks. Yeah, that was from Steve. Yeah, and we also, as part of the 2023 Aroma campaign, we were transiting back from Ohio to California and had the opportunity to fly an instrumented DC-8 aircraft filled with basically any type of chemical speciation measurement you could ever hope to have. So we flew for about an hour in the valley. And so we're looking at that data too.
Awesome. What I'm hearing is maybe we should have another seminar to, highlight the new findings when those come out. Okay. I won't hold you to that. Thank you so much, Karen, for speaking to us today, and congratulations on winning the award on behalf of your whole team. Congratulations to your whole team for winning the Outstanding Scientific Paper Award.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember to come back next week for the next paper in the series. And I hope you all have a safe, wonderful weekend ahead. Take care.